So, first up, it's a great pleasure to welcome Warren Montag, Professor of Comparative Literature at Occidental in Los Angeles. We know him as a distinguished scholar of Spinoza, of course, but his most recent book is Althusser and his contemporaries. He's also the editor of the online journal Décalage, and today he's going to speak to us about un mero esecutore, Moses, God, fortune in the prince. Okay. Warren.
Thank you very much. Before I attempt to offer a reading of Machiavelli on Moses, I want to point out that it was in relation to Moses and to the Bible that Machiavelli posed the question of how to read a text, especially a text so often read and thus so apparently and perhaps deceptively familiar as the Bible. And I'm quoting from Discourses 3:30. And whoever reads the Bible attentively will see Moses, in wanting that his laws and his orders be observed, was forced to kill an infinite number of men who opposed his designs, moved by nothing else other than envy. Chi legge la Bibbia sensatamente, or as it's translated, whoever reads the Bible sensatamente, that is, attentively, intelligently, with discernment. There are other translations, and I'm going to come back to this word in a minute. With this proviso, Machiavelli in the Discourses introduces a proposition concerning Moses, a proposition that condenses into one hyperbolic sequence the necessary relation between laws, leggi, and institutions or orders, ordini, on the one side and violence on the other. To defend his new state, and we should note that his laws and institutions are not yet fully realized, in part because of the obstacle of the envy of others, and unwilling to rely on fortuna, Moses was compelled to, quote, kill an infinite number of men, unquote, ammazzare infiniti uomini. And he does so both to protect his laws and his orders, but also to permit their further development. But beyond the provocative content of Machiavelli's, in a sense, literalist reading of Scripture, is the provocation of its form. To read the Bible sensatamente is to reject the allegorical interpretation without which Christianity could hardly claim the Hebrew Scripture as its Old Testament. Machiavelli accordingly makes no effort to convert Moses' violence into a mere sign of a properly spiritual chastisement or an allegory. But in the midst of this otherwise literal reading, even of the acts of mass destruction that must accompany the founding of new principalities through virtu, the adjective infiniti stands out. We must not so quickly translate it as a great many or countless, as many have done, or reduce it to a merely rhetorical function. Moreover, Machiavelli insists that the idea of killing an infinite number of men, and perhaps just as importantly, the idea of the infinite itself, disguised here as an adjective, is found by reading the Bible, or at least Exodus, sensatamente. We are thus presented with the paradoxical conjunction that only such a reading of the Bible can uncover. The infinite as a concept appears only at the moment of the beginning, as if that which has no beginning or end becomes thinkable against the backdrop of the void that can neither be found nor delivered by destiny, but which must be made in order to be filled with new laws and institutions. Let us recall that in Exodus 23, verses 20 through 24, God abandons the Hebrew people to the violence that they, rather than he, must commit, sending them not only to annihilate the nations that already occupy the land that he has, quote, prepared for them, but even to smash the pillars of their buildings, smash them to pieces, as if they too were contaminated by idolatry and unfit for use. It might be imagined that what amounts to a total destruction of what came before, so that not even the memory of it would remain, would leave the Hebrew people free to establish a state that, because it was founded on principles of justice and piety, decreed by God himself, would persist forever as a light unto other nations, as it said. But the establishment of such a state reveals only the opposite. The very element within which the new order under the leadership I made a mistake there. Reveals only the opposite. The ceaseless or infinite concourse of fortuna inside as well as outside the new principality and its people. The very element within which the new order, under the leadership of the armed prophet, must perpetually adjust itself if it is to survive and not to fall to ruin. Machiavelli has thus been able to intuit, against the best efforts of translators, the fact that in the Hebrew of Genesis and Exodus, no beginning is an arche in the Greek sense, and no end is a telos. At this point, we may begin to suspect that it is not simply his acuity as a reader that is at issue here. It is rather a question of the position from which he reads and of what becomes visible from its vantage point alone. Of course, the injunction to read sensatamente applies not simply, or even most importantly, to the Bible, but also to Machiavelli's reading of the Bible, and in particular, his account of Moses. And there is no point in Machiavelli's work in which the complexities and stakes of his reading are more evident than in chapter 6 of The Prince. Completely new principalities, that is, principalities whose ruler and forms of government are new, are more likely to endure if they are acquired and established through the forces and virtu of the new prince, rather than by the favor or gift, that is, the charis or gratia of fortuna. At this point, we cannot avoid confronting the difficulties posed by Machiavelli's use of fortuna, difficulties located above all in the text of the Prince itself, and only secondarily in the readings advanced by interpreters. While readers such as Leo Strauss and Althusser might with no apparent hesitation translate fortuna as chance, contingency, or accident, and thus as a rejection of any notion of destiny, more recent commentators have pointed out that the term was not necessarily understood in opposition to Christian notions of oikonomia, pronoia, or providencia. Thus, fortuna might be conceived not only as the lived experience of providence from the point of view of a single human individual who couldn't possibly grasp a concatenation of events in an order whose temporal span necessarily surpasses his understanding, but even as an ignorance of God's design, that is, the ignorance of the individual himself, might be necessary to the unfolding of God's design. The barbarian invasions of Rome, the destruction of the empire, the military defeat of so many princes, that is, the very events which appeared to constitute the operations of fortune, whether or not they were confronted by actors endowed with virtu or simply passively suffered, might be lived as misfortune, but from the perspective of God's creation in its totality, could be seen as necessary means to the end of the universalization of his word. Further, was not the so-called virtu of a given prince that which allowed him apparently to surmount or even simply to adjust to circumstances, itself an element of providence, even if it came in the form of an evil intention whose consequence was a greater good? Such notions, however, as Aristotle shows very clearly, are in no way incompatible with the sense of the tragic, which might precisely be located in the discrepancy between the contingency of lived experience, a contingency for us, and the teleology which is the object of our faith, even as its order surpasses our understanding. Neither Strauss nor Althusser are unaware of the possibility of such a reading of Machiavelli, and in different and, I would argue, opposing ways, maintain that in The Prince, the possibility of a reading must constantly be suggested by Machiavelli himself, as if to remind the reader that the statements that initially appear to exceed the boundaries of Christian doctrine may be finally reinscribed in it. For Strauss, this takes the form of what we might call topographical or vertical. The notion of fortuna as chance lies under and is covered by a language of providence. The religious and biblical references are thus, quote, only a mask, entirely external to the, quote, unbelief they conceal, and can accordingly be easily removed in the act of reading, if indeed the act of removing the mask can even be separated from the act of reading. For Althusser, who, we should observe, does not perform on Machiavelli what he elsewhere calls a symptomatic reading, these elements constitute contradictions or discrepancies whose form is always necessarily horizontal, and thus not susceptible to an uncovering or unconcealment, in that the elements exist side by side but isolated from each other, such that the whole does not register their unity or even the coexistence of these parts. To help us understand the conflictuality proper to Machiavelli's text, we might profitably turn to a number of unacknowledged references to Quintus Curtius, whose History of Alexander was a very important source for Machiavelli's concept of fortuna, also very important for Spinoza. In a striking passage, Quintus Curtius goes so far as to define the antinomy itself of fortuna, understood as chance, and providential order, this antinomy, as the primary obstacle to an understanding of the actual sequence of events that constitutes history. This is a quote from Quintus Curtius. "Those may scoff at my belief who are convinced that human affairs roll on and take place by mere chance, or that each man runs his ordered course in accordance with a combination of hidden causes determined long beforehand by an immutable law." Chapter 25 of The Prince begins, quote, "I am not unaware that many have been and still are of the opinion that the things of this world, le cose del mondo, are in a sense, in modo, governed by fortuna and by God, that men with their prudence cannot change them, that there is no remedy for them, and that thus there is no sense sweating over these things, but simply allow them to be governed by fate, sorte." Okay, and I can't go into this. I'm departing from my text for a second, but we have to be struck by the phrase "by fortuna and by God," and it's very difficult for me maybe only, but I can't help but see something like "Deus sive fortuna" when I read that. Okay. And that's probably my problem, but anyway. What is remarkable here is the rendering equivalent in a political sense of the two otherwise opposed senses of fortune, indeterminacy and teleological determination. Both deprive political action of any effect. Either an act is a priori without necessary or calculable consequences, as if once accomplished, it simply disappears into the chaos of things never to be seen again, or in contrast, an act is already inscribed in a causal order that pre-exists us and leads us to an end that we cannot know, in which case we are no more than means to an end of a providential design that, again, surpasses our understanding. Machiavelli's critique of the functional equivalence of these two notions of fortuna leads him to some of the most famous and indeed extravagant assertions in The Prince. While fortuna, however we understand it, is the arbiter of half our actions, it leaves the government of the other half to us. Finally, at the chapter's conclusion, fortuna can be mastered and compelled to submit, it's very famous, as if it were a woman, if we batterla e urtarla, as if a prince's virtù depended on the strength of his will, his resolve, or audacity alone. Machiavelli, at this point, has appeared to so many readers to have confined his reflections to the familiar oppositions between free will and determinism, or freedom and necessity. But if this is indeed the case, he has diverged from his own philosophical trajectory and abandoned the project of, if we follow Althusser, conceiving a necessity without finality, a necessity of the infinite that arises from contingent encounters, the only necessity that matters for politics, the necessity that determines whether a prince, by being good, will increase or decrease his power. Althusser's conception, which is not in the book on Machiavelli, but not only applies to Machiavelli, but was inspired by him, is this, quote, instead of thinking contingency as a modality of necessity or as an exception to it, we must think necessity as the becoming necessary of the encounter of contingencies. Further, the opposition so central to Machiavelli's political theory of fortuna and virtù is not only not confined to this familiar antinomy, but will disrupt it with the introduction of a third term, without which any application of virtù, whether individual or collective to fortuna, that is to la verità effettuale della cosa, would be impossible. This third term, occasione, derived from the Latin occasio, which is in turn a translation of the Greek kairos, does not designate that which mediates between virtù and fortuna, but precisely the always only temporary absence of mediation, an opening or a breach, what Althusser called, quote, a certain empty place, empty so that it may be filled, empty so that there may be inserted there the action of an individual or group of men who will take up a position in it and on this basis collect the forces capable of accomplishing the political task that history has assigned them, empty for the future. It is this other way of reading that allows us to imagine the term fortuna in the Prince as neither univocal nor the site of a philosophical conspiracy that it is left to the reader to unmask. In other words, whoever reads the Prince, or more precisely the Prince as a reading of the Bible sensatamente, will discover not what is hidden, but what cannot be hidden. Roberto Esposito has argued recently that if one can speak of the specificity of Italian philosophy at its origins, Machiavelli and Bruno are his primary reference points, this specificity surely lies in its rejection of the project characteristic of the dominant forms of European political and philosophical thought. For Esposito, this project is above all defined by the attempt to contain, if not to master fortuna, as if it could be warded off by philosophical certainties, Descartes, or ever more complicated theodicies, in which a logic of compensation absorbs every evil and derives from it a greater good. But most typically, fortuna takes the form of a threatening exterior against which the social body in its integrity had to be protected, or in Esposito's phrase, immunized, rather than that which, from the inside as well as the outside, relates us to our thought and action by dividing us from ourselves in a kind of fold that increases our power. Further, while to so many early modern philosophers fortuna would appear only negatively as the absence of order, which far from being a realm of freedom was rather a condition of ungovernable contingency to which one could only submit as if to fate, Machiavelli sees something else, not a hidden order, whether immanent or transcendent, but something far more profound. In the absence of order, events fall like rain upon the world, sometimes to our benefit, when, for example, there is neither flood nor drought and crops flourish, and sometimes not, when an increase in temperature ruins crops and the people, fearing starvation, revolt. And when revolts fail, sometimes captive populations are enslaved and, among other things, set to work building magnificent cities, perhaps in the land of Egypt. Okay. In the constant variability of things, for so many the cause of fear, in the events that fall upon the world and befall us, one, on the condition that the present or future prince can read fortuna like the Bible sensatamente, and exercises the virtù or power to seize that moment and occupy it, becomes the opening through which the prince, that is, his assembled forces, must pass to upend the fragile balance of power that constitutes the present, to defend laws and orders that he has created, or in contrast, to establish something new. Of such princes, Moses is neither the first nor perhaps the best example, even if he is an important reference point for an Italy struggling to liberate itself from the barbarians. And in addition, he is a prince whose cruelty, even if allegorized, was known and accepted. But the recourse to Moses was a way to accomplish what Althusser called, quote, the voiding of all the philosophical concepts of Plato and Aristotle in order to think the possibility of making Italy a national state, unquote. Through Moses, and therefore through his appropriation of a translation whose very obscurities and elisions testified to the uneasy coexistence of Hebrew, Greek, and Latin concepts, the first two packed into the last and straining its resources to the breaking point, Machiavelli is able not only to lay siege to the dominant forms of medieval Christian theology and perhaps political theology, but to exploit their internal divisions and thereby diminish their power. The verse from Exodus chapter 2, verse 10, provides an opening. The Pharaoh's daughter, this is when Moses is sent down the river in a basket. You all know this passage. And it's interesting, I'll give you a little lesson now. It's interesting that the word in Hebrew for basket is the same word that's used for the ark in Noah's ark. It's exactly the same word. Okay. The Pharaoh's daughter calls Moses Moshe in Hebrew. She says, quote, this is from the King James Version. We have to translate, everything is a translation, okay? Because I drew him out of the water. And of course in English, when you say I called him Moses because I drew him out of the water, it's absolutely meaningless. It marks it as a translation, but you don't know what it's about, and sorry, but it doesn't matter, I guess, okay? The Vulgate renders the phrase quia de aqua tuli eum, a translation that transforms the Hebrew verb, which I'll talk about, to pull from, or perhaps to pull out, as tuli, which is it's a conjugation of the verb phero, meaning to carry or to bear. Now, even if we read this in Hebrew, it doesn't clarify things exactly. The great medieval Jewish commentators on this passage, such as Rashi, Ibn Ezra, and others, were divided over the meaning of Moses' name. And you should keep in mind that the book of Exodus in Hebrew is called Shemot, which means names. Does the name Moshe signify or merely suggest the one who is pulled from, or the one who, in contrast, pulled something or someone else from? That is, does the name denote the subject or object of an action, or both, perhaps simultaneously? And then to take it further, is the action that of just pulling, in which case the Hebrew word would be masha, which is spelled exactly like Moshe, or, as Rashi argued, is the verb mashach, which means to pull something out of something else. Okay. In a crucial moment, or the crucial moment on Mount Horeb at the burning bush, Exodus 3, verses 1 through 4, Moses is called by God, pulled out of his way, as it were. But as the text makes very clear, and it's a very strange moment in the text, God's call is preceded in chapter 3, verse 3, by Moses literally calling to himself. That is, it says Moses said to himself, turn towards the thorn bush, turn towards the bush. And he thus pulls himself away from his path. This scene might better be understood as a swerving into an encounter, and therefore as a conjunction, given that it is only when God sees Moses turning towards the bush that he then calls out to him, taking him out of his way once again and calling him to be sent to take the Hebrew people out of what is called the Beit Avadim, the house of slavery. Similarly, in Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 through 12, very well known, Moses is described as turning from his way without warning, without any sign from God, or indeed any sign that God is present as an agent or an observer of Moses' action at the sight of the slave driver beating the Hebrew slave. Thus, the pulling away or the taking out of, the turning from, the deviation, the detour, the swerve. And of course, we might say, if we can imagine Machiavelli reading the account of Moses closely and thus sensatamente through Lucretius, reading it rigorously, that is to the letter, as if Lucretius' critique freed him from the reign of the concept of providence, that this was the precondition rather than the result of Moses' encounter with God. Let us then follow Machiavelli's own text closely. We may discover that the fortuna-virtù relation, itself part of a multilingual semantic field in which Italian, Latin, Greek, and to some extent, to the extent that Machiavelli is speaking of Moses, Hebrew, conditioned through the work of translation and of translating the untranslatable, its meaning. I refer precisely to the Latin terms casus and occasio, and to the term I referred to earlier, the important term of kairos, the Greek word. Machiavelli begins chapter 6 with a contradiction that Althusser, among others, has noted. Those who would, quote, acquire entirely new principalities, both in their prince and their government, that is, principalities acquired with virtu, must arrange it so that the laws and institutions that existed before are evacuated, leaving a void filled by the new prince, so that new laws and institutions, which in some way are unprecedented, will represent the calculated response of a prudent ruler to the circumstances of his principality. But the entirely new can come into existence only by imitating, that is, repeating, earlier exemplary actions, albeit sensatamente, or even by entering the path cleared and repeatedly trodden by one's predecessors. Of course, it is not possible to follow their steps exactly without deviation, and although this deviation is initially marked as a decline, those who cannot walk in the steps of great men will at least preserve the odore of greatness. The next sentence reinstates it as necessary to success itself. Quote, he should act like those prudent archers who, when the target they are aiming at seems too far off, aware of the capacity of their bow, set their sight a good deal higher than the desired target, loco, place. Not to reach such a height with their arrow, but rather to be able, with the help of aiming high, to reach their target. Thus, archers, or rather prudent archers, only hit their target by aiming not at it, but above it, as if to aim at a greatness we cannot hope to achieve will allow us to exercise the prudence necessary to both to establish and to maintain a completely new principality. But there is another sense to this allegory of the archers, one that has little to do with the hierarchical distinction between the great and the excellent and those less so, those whose only hope of success lies in imitating their betters. Machiavelli's example also refers to what is now called the archer's paradox. The fact that an arrow must be aimed slightly away from the center of a target in order to hit it. That is, that an arrow fired in a straight line at a target will miss it. In fact, it is precisely this notion of warfare and of the need to hit the target that allows us to argue that for Machiavelli one imitates great men by precisely not imitating them. That is, by aiming at and then deviating from their example, just as they in their greatness did not precisely imitate their predecessors ad infinitum. The founder of the completely new imitates by deviating from those he imitates, as they were compelled to deviate from what was imitated by them. Just as he must aim by not aiming at an always singular spot, which is precisely the spot he either hits or will be destroyed. It is precisely this idea of the target, as the terms loco and disegno in this passage are often translated, that leads us back to fortuna and the question of occasione, through which men alone relate to fortuna, even if this relation can never be one of mastery or domination. In fact, a similar description of archers aiming at their targets appears in Euripides' Supplicants, line 745, where men in war are described as, quote, aiming the bow beyond the target, unquote. And the Greek word for target here is precisely kairos, whose usage thus deviates from our predominantly temporal conception of both kairos and occasione, and compels us to turn towards the question of place. As Richard Onions has shown, kairos initially meant target or mark, usually in reference to warfare. In the Iliad, for example, it signifies the deadliest place on the body that an arrow may penetrate. More recently, Thomas Rickard has argued that the renewed focus on kairos in Anglo-American study has tended to neglect the spatial meaning of the term, a meaning that, while older than its temporal sense, coexisted with it and gave it its force as a concept. Quote, the earliest uses of kairos were grounded in a sense of place, but not just any place. Kairos, how much more time do I have? Got 30. Okay, I'll keep going. Okay. The earliest uses of kairos were grounded in a sense of place, but not just any place. Kairos does not just refer to the target at which one aims, but also a penetrable opening, an aperture, unquote. It is this weak point in a soldier's armor, the spot at which an archer must aim if he hopes to kill the opponent, or the point, quote, the part of the body, and I'm quoting Euripides again, where a weapon can penetrate to the life within. And just as all armor has its weak points, every state, no matter how well armed, has its vulnerable places that no effort at fortification, and I'm speaking here both literally and metaphorically, politically as well as militarily, can entirely eliminate, and may well, in fact, in a dialectical manner, aggravate. But only a specific conjunction of circumstances will place that weak point within range of the archer skilled enough to strike it and penetrate to the life within. And the archer, for his part, must pull away from the straight line to see the aperture and point his arrow slightly away from the kairos to strike it. Machiavelli's image thus belongs to a translinguistic field composed of overlapping semantic networks and forms the aperture that his work has opened in this field. Through it, something is either pulled in or pulled out. There operates here a logic of location and dislocation, or rather a location that rests on an originary dislocation. If we follow Machiavelli's argument through chapter 6, it appears that the concept of occasione, insofar as it refers to this history through a nexus of translations, allusions, and associations, cannot simply be rendered as opportunity without losing precisely what will confer on his account of Moses its intelligibility as well as its importance for the prince. Machiavelli advances his argument by postulating that the prince, quote, who has trusted least in fortuna, has maintained his position best, succeeding per propria virtu. And it is this last formulation, by his own virtu, that the problems peculiar to Moses alone among such princes are posed. Quote, although one should not discuss Moses, for he was a mere executor of the things commanded by God, okay, uno mero esecutore delle cose che gli erano ordinate di Dio, he should nevertheless be admired for that grace, gratia, that made him worthy of speaking with God, unquote. This sentence, familiar to all readers of The Prince, is like the narrative of Exodus itself, precisely too familiar. It is already read for us, already translated, not simply into another language, but into a theological political idiom, and therefore from the strange into the familiar. There are few passages in Machiavelli's text with which translators have taken greater liberties, as if the passage were written to be translated, that is, if the literal words were from the outset destined to fade before the meaning of which they are merely the sign. Of course, at the same time, no reader can fail to register the shock of seeing Moses linked to Romulus, a reaction that Machiavelli carefully cultivated by appearing to admit that Moses, a mere executor, really doesn't belong to the list of those who have founded states through virtu, or rather per propria virtu, given that Moses' power was not his own. In part, however, by rendering him a mere executor or agent of God's orders, Machiavelli displaces the responsibility for the killing of an infinite number of men onto the legal, moral author of the actions, that is God himself. He thus legitimizes the use of force, although it needed no such legitimation, and perhaps more to the point, shows that violence, legitimate or not, was nevertheless necessary even in the unique case of a state governed by God. But this does not exhaust the significance of the passage, and above all, the phrase that has often provoked translators to search for more figurative equivalents. I refer especially to the phrase le cose che gli erano ordinate di Dio, which translators have condensed into God's will, or what God has commanded. So that the text reads, for he was a mere executor of God's will, or what God commanded, or in French, des ordres de Dieu. The status of the thing, or cosa, in Machiavelli's text, where the word is often treated by translators as if it were a vague gesture at a more specific meaning that they feel compelled to supply, is worth considering. In the phrase from chapter 15, la verità effettuale della cosa or thing, as Althusser talks about this, has a very precise meaning and function. The modi e governi de una principe together form a thing subject not to legal, moral, or theological principles derived from an essence or a telos, but to the variability of the rerum natura, the nature of things and the things that compose nature. Its truth as a thing among things rather than as an expression, representation, emanation, or incarnation of what lies beyond nature exists in and only in the effects it produces in this world. Those who look to the good beyond will be destroyed and their good with them. It is precisely this variability and tumult that Machiavelli calls in chapter 3 on mixed principalities, l'ordine delle cose, the order of things, demonstrating that by reality and order he means the same thing. To take things to the extreme, we might even say that l'ordine delle cose, the order of things, and le cose che gli erano ordinate de Dio, the things ordered by God, not only can, but must be one and the same thing. And also that both, determined by the movement of Machiavelli's text, no more linear itself than the movement of history, are equivalent to, I'm not going to say the Italian because I'm racing to get through this, from chapter 3, time chases each thing before it and brings both the good with the bad and the bad with the good, unquote. What does this mean for our understanding of Moses? In one sense, it reverses or at least complicates the order of causality and authority. The actions Moses executed were by the fact of their execution ordered by God, in the double sense of being commanded and of being arranged by God. The case of Exodus is particularly pertinent here, insofar as God, like time, according to Machiavelli, sends the bad with the good, hardening the Pharaoh's heart in response to Moses' demand to set the Hebrew slaves free. And even as it is impossible, after 2 millennia of Christian doctrine, not to look for a providential meaning in the idea for which there is no explanation or justification in Scripture itself, that God caused the Pharaoh to do evil, and to do so repeatedly and at great cost to himself and his people, it was possible, especially under the influence of Lucretius's critique of providence and destiny, to see God's order as nothing more than the disposition of things as they are, without reference to an ideal or an intention beyond them. It is this sense that Moses, quote, who had so great a preceptor, unquote, was no different from the other princes who founded and maintained states by means of a mind, quote, disposed to turn itself according to the winds of fortuna and the variability of things. Chapter 18, I'm almost done. Has Machiavelli, as has been so often asserted, simply replaced God with great men endowed with godlike power? On the contrary, the place of God has been abolished and replaced by an encounter not only or even primarily between people, but also between things in his sense, another word that we'd have to look at. An encounter that may not and often does not take place. Without the occasione that fortune offers, those who possess the attribute of virtù, Machiavelli tells us, virtù would be spenta or extinguished, just as in the absence of virtù, the occasione, quote, comes in vain, unquote. Out of this encounter, if it does take place, something new emerges, a new prince executing decrees that do not exist before or outside of their execution, an armed prophet whose weapon is the power of the armed multitude and whose fortress is their support. Perhaps this encounter is what was once meant by grace, the grace that was not given by God, if we follow Machiavelli's text, but which allowed Moses to speak with God, as if God himself appeared only from the conjunction of a prince and his enslaved people, from the swerve and the collision, as God calls out the name of Moses twice, the one who was and will be pulled out, the one who has pulled and will pull the others out of what Machiavelli calls slavery and oppression. The name Moses thus marks a kairos in the prince, a target of interpretation, an opening in fortune's web, the hole through which an arrow might pass, not to the life within, but to the infinite to which Machiavelli beckons. Thank you.
Okay, so we now have 5 minutes for discussion, which leaves us a few question timing issues.
Can I? Warren, I leave aside the whole philosophical construction for a moment. My first reaction, as you were expanding your argument, was a reaction of skepticism for the following simple philological reason, or a question of, well, a way of reading texts. Namely that you had to put together the letter of the different passages where Machiavelli alludes to Moses, that is essentially chapter 6 of the Prince, and chapter 30 of book 3 of the Discorsi for the infinite number, blah, blah. And then, so I thought this is very problematic. I mean, it suggests something like a latent interpretation, full interpretation of the character of Moses that Machiavelli would have distributed among different places in his text, to which you have to add, of course, the final chapter of the Prince. And then progressively, because this took time, wonderfully, an argument in favor of your way of reading the text came to my mind, which was suggested by the previous presentation by Fabio, and which in a sense will lead us to returning to something that John Najemi said yesterday, namely the fact that in two of these passages, that is Prince 1:6 and Discorsi 3:30, Moses is discussed together with Savonarola. So the question of the two prophets, two kinds of prophets, is brought. So Savonarola is the hidden, perhaps the latent point of comparison, which makes it possible to combine these different reflections on Moses. But then, as a consequence, you may ask yourself if Savonarola is not also somehow haunting the final chapter of the Prince. And then if you bring back what John was discussing yesterday with respect to Valentino, then the final suggestion of what you say would be the following. To redeem Italy, we can rely neither on a figure like Savonarola, who is an unarmed prophet, nor on a figure like Valentino, who is armed, more or less well, but is not a prophet. And therefore what we would need would be a third kind that perhaps is impossible, who knows, but that would be precisely the armed prophet, or etc. But that's, okay.
Just 1 minute.
Okay. Oh, I don't need that. Yeah, okay. I mean, I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think, again, I want to caution against too quick an assumption that we can completely understand, or that the use of Moses is simply something like a given, that it fits very neatly into the contemporary situation because, as would be later for the Protestant Reformation, etc., people use the Exodus myth as a way of justifying it. Because what I'm trying to do is to say that his emphasis on reading the Bible in a very rigorous way is going to release other meanings. I don't disagree that meaning is there. I think it is there. But I think there may be other meanings, and I think it would go... it would call into question the idea that there's a sort of a priori set of positions, the armed, the unarmed, and something in between, which may be impossible. Because I think there is something like that in Machiavelli. That's one of the contradictions. But against that is the idea that one can never establish a priori either the nature of the prince himself, who could be suddenly armed, and not simply armed, as we say in English, armed and dangerous, that he could actually be effective. That these things are always in play. And there's nothing that guarantees that the armed prince isn't going to be defeated because he can't read Fortuna and misses the occasione, etc. And so I think what you've identified as a tension, which is right, is between something like a structure on the one side, that a grid through which Machiavelli would like to read history, but then another sense that no such grid is strictly speaking possible, because in each case, I'm going with Althusser, it's the conjuncture, it's the specificity of the disposition of forces in a given moment. And I think that's, I would talk about that if I had more time. And it goes back to what Jacques was saying yesterday about the different notions of fortuna, because again, all these terms, as has been said, these are very complicated terms, and none of them have even, a handful. I mean, they function in different ways depending on their place in the text and all that. So anyway.
Thank you very much, Warren.